Namo Phat, good morning. Thank you for joining me for our daily practice check-in. Listen, listen, listen. This beautiful sound calls us back to our true home. The second mindfulness training. Aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression, I vow to cultivate loving kindness and learn ways to work for the well-being of people, animals, plants, and minerals. I will practice generosity by sharing my time, energy, and material resources with those who are in real need. I am determined not to steal and not to possess anything that should belong to others. I will respect the property of others, but I will prevent others from profiting from human suffering or the suffering of other species on earth. Our Dharma lesson this morning is from Ajahn Thiradhammo's book, Working with the Five Hindrances, on sensual pleasure. Sensual pleasure is mentioned in many contexts in the Buddha's teaching. It is the first of the four objects of grasping, upadana, the three thirsts, tanha, the four floods, oga, the four outflows, asava, the four bonds, yoga, and the three longings, isana. It is one of the three wrong thoughts, micca vitaka, and as a practice, it is one of the extremes to be avoided in following the middle way. Although it refers to any form of sensual pleasure, sexual pleasure is always implied, and often sexual intercourse is specifically meant. For example, the third of the five precepts is almost always translated as refraining from sexual misconduct, kamesu michachara, explained as refraining from inappropriate sexual intercourse. The most common reference to sense pleasures is to the five physical sense objects, the five strands of sensual pleasure, kamaguna, sights, sounds, odors, tastes, and sensations that are agreeable, enjoyable, pleasing, likable, accompanied by pleasure, enticing. At several places in the Pali Canon, covetousness, abhijja, is used in place of sensual desire with reference to the five hindrances. Covetousness, which is synonymous with greed, lobha, would imply a broadening of the topic to also encompass mental objects. This would then include greed for ideas, concepts, and self-images, fame, wealth, health, etc., giving rise to views and opinions about self, ego pleasure, which frequently manifest as a serious hindrance for some people. The Buddha had a very specific and particular view regarding sensual pleasures. While acknowledging that they do give the gratification of happiness and well-being, sukha somanasa, he gave many teachings explaining the limitations and dangers of following them, using some striking similes to illustrate his point. The main reason for this is that whatever one frequently ponders on or thinks over, that becomes the inclination of the mind. Thus, thinking much about sensual pleasures eventually habituates the mind to thinking that way consistently. Also, it is impossible to engage in sensual pleasures without having sensual enjoyment, perceptions of sensual pleasures, and thoughts of sensual pleasure. That is, sensual pleasure tends to overwhelm the mind. On the other hand, the Buddha, perhaps aware that human beings are instinctively beings of pleasure, praised and encouraged the experience of spiritual happiness. For example, two of the exercises for developing meditation on breathing specifically mention training the mind to follow the breath while experiencing rapture and bliss, piti sukha. When the Buddha-to-be was on his spiritual quest before his awakening, He reflected that thoughts of sensual pleasure led to his own and others' affliction, obstructs wisdom, is associated with distress, and is not conducive to nibbana. He contrasted this with renunciation, nekkhamma, which he realized has the opposite effects and is conducive to nibbana. He had a similar realization regarding thoughts of ill will and harming and their opposites. With these three kinds of skillful thoughts as the basis, he was able to develop the increasingly refined states of concentration, jhana, which he experienced as resulting in a happiness far superior to sensual pleasure. He referred to this as the bliss of renunciation, the bliss of seclusion, the bliss of calming, the bliss of awakening, which should be pursued and is not to be feared. When one has experienced the bliss and rapture from jhana, infatuation with worldly sensual pleasure is broken. However, states of jhana are only a temporary respite from the attraction of sensual pleasures. The Buddha did, though, discover a complete escape from sensual pleasures. This is the putting away and giving up of desire and lust for sensual pleasures, which occurs at the third and of the four levels of awakening. In brief, the Buddha teaches that the way to experience the escape from sensual desires is to understand as they really are, yata bhuta, the origin and passing away, and the gratification, danger, and escape regarding sensual pleasures. This is called the severance of the bond of sensuality. Thus, when one truly understands how unreliable and ultimately unsatisfying pleasures of the senses really are, desire and lust for them completely cease. The key to ultimate freedom from sensuality is understanding it as it really is, that is, to the level of ultimate truth. However, it is really a matter of degrees. Understanding a little allows a little respite from sensuality, and the deeper the understanding, the more complete the freedom. As most of us can probably appreciate, this escape is easier said than done. The complete ending of sensual desire is a very advanced level of awakening, so there is no need to worry about it too much. In fact, I would say that we need a certain degree of sensual pleasure in the form of comfort in order to continue to live and pursue spiritual practice. If the body is uncomfortable, we have a natural desire to relieve its discomfort or pain, or we succumb to ill will and or restlessness, two of the other hindrances. The mind needs to experience a certain degree of safety and security before it can be non-defensive and open to new reflections or contemplations. We can, of course, sometimes move outside our comfort zone to some degree, although it is often hard to differentiate between what we need and what we want. Am I obsessing about food because the body is malnourished? Or am I bored or lonely? How much are we furnishing our needs, and how much are we nourishing our unsatiated desires? It should be emphasized that sensual pleasures in themselves are not hindrances, fetters, or underlying dispositions. It is the desire or lust for them that becomes a hindrance, fetter, or underlying disposition. The key element in sensual pleasure is a pleasant feeling, the happiness and well-being, sukha somanasa, which it induces. Pleasant feelings allow a relaxing and even melting away of self-reference with its stress and anxiety. People lose themselves in pleasant feelings. In contrast, unpleasant feeling pressures the self to find relief from the perceived threat to its existence. Just listen to how loudly the self screams when in pain. Notice what you do when you are emotionally uncomfortable. Turn on some pleasing music, watch a movie, look for something to eat, etc. That is, try to escape into some form of sensual pleasure. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you for joining me this morning.